Please give a warm after-lunch welcome to Professor Elizabeth Elliott.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you, Meg, for the invitation to speak today. It's been a fabulous morning. I'm really speaking to you about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and its relationship to juvenile justice. But I'd like to start by paying my respects to the owners of the Bundjalung country and to the traditional owners of all the lands on which I live and work. So, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is potentially preventable. It's caused by prenatal alcohol exposure, and it's got a very complex pathogenesis and a very varied presentation. And of course, what we see in a child or an adult is a mix of prenatal alcohol exposure and the impact of their genetics, their epigenetics, and of course the environment in which they're raised. But the key element of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is severe neurodevelopmental impairment. And this may occur with or without characteristic facial features and birth defects, depending on the timing of the exposure. So you will only get those physical defects with exposure in the first trimester of pregnancy. And as you can see from this slide, both these physical features and the small brain can be reproduced in animal models. Of course, this condition has lifelong consequences associated with disability, but as we've heard this morning, individuals living with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder have many strengths, and we really need to focus and build on those. So why does prenatal alcohol exposure matter? Well, alcohol readily crosses the placenta, and it's neurotoxic, that is, it damages the nerves and the brain. And it's also teratogenic, that is, it disrupts the development of structures causing birth defects. And it has what's called epigenetic effects. So it can switch certain genes on and off that might confer a risk for adverse health outcomes later in life. Now, in Australia, unfortunately, we have a binge drinking culture, and it's particularly in teens and young women, and particularly as women have become better educated and earning more money, they want to be out with the boys and drinking as much as they are. And of course, this is often associated with unplanned sexual experiences, and pregnancy in Australia is unplanned still in about 49% of cases. And I think what we need to remember is that any child exposed to alcohol prenatally is potentially at risk of a whole range of harms, including, but not exclusive to fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. So what is the prevalence of FASD? Well, it's estimated from World Health Organization data that it's about a bit under 1% of the general population worldwide. But remember that many women in many countries don't drink alcohol. And so this prevalence varies considerably, up to 11%, 11 per 100 children in South Africa. And it's estimated that well over 600,000 children are born per year with this disorder. That's likely an underestimate, but nevertheless it's thought to be the leading cause of intellectual disability and birth defects, and as I said, potentially preventable. In Australia, we don't have any good prevalence data for the general population, but based on North American and European data, we reckon it's between 2 and 4 per 100 children. So we're not seeing anything like that number of children diagnosed. But there are also very identifiable high-risk groups, and they include children who are in foster care, justice settings, mental health settings, orphanages, some Indigenous populations, and children living in rural and remote settings. And I want to tell you now briefly about how Aboriginal people, particularly women, in the far northwest of Australia in the Kimberley, have really grappled with this issue and led research that has changed the life trajectories for children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. So I've had the privilege of being invited to work in these communities back in 2009, following implementation of alcohol restrictions by two very courageous women in the community, June Oscar and Emily Carter. They then developed a strategy called the Maraloo strategy to address the diagnosis and support for families living with FASD and to try and prevent this in their community. This is a very remote community, and it's got many of the problems of historic trauma and current disadvantage that we've heard of. But of course it's also up in northwest Australia, subject to annual flooding, and in early 2023 had the 1 in 500-year flood. And so many people in that community are still displaced 18 months later. This is a town that arose when people from 5 distinct language groups were really tossed off pastoral country, which was their traditional land, and thrust into a makeshift town of Fitzroy Crossing, which is surrounded by 36 very remote communities. Now, June Oscar, who has recently been our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner at the Human Rights Commission, said to Parliament back in 2008, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is a tragedy that somehow transcends other aspects of grief and trauma. Here is innocent young life, the future of our people, our culture, our language, knowledge about the magic creation and laws of our country, being born into this world with brains and nervous systems that are so impaired that life for that person from birth to death is cruelly diminished. And this really led her to invite us to help establish, was there a problem with alcohol use in pregnancy and was there a problem with FASD in their community? They felt that if there was no data, there would be no problem identifiable and hence no action to follow. And we were very aware of the potential for stigmatisation in this community, so spent a very long time in consultation and planning with the community before we even started this project. We had participation by 97% of all children aged 7 to 9 living in these 36 communities. 55% of them were exposed to very high levels of alcohol, maybe 10 or more drinks 3 or 4 times a week, and 1 in 5 of them had fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. But of course many of them also had early life trauma, and they had all the learning, behavioural and physical challenges at home and at school that you might expect from this diagnosis. Nevertheless, a lot of good came out of this project. These children had full examinations, they had access to additional help in the classroom, they had access to specialist health services. The community were praised for the courage in facing this issue. It helped them continue to maintain the alcohol restrictions, and indeed in some communities such as Wonkajonka to introduce that it was an alcohol-free community. It enabled them to think about different pathways for kids at school, to develop resources for teachers, and to produce some films that were used to educate the communities. Nevertheless, some of these children had early contact with the juvenile justice system, trashing the school, stealing cars. One child in our cohort stole a car and unfortunately that crashed and another of the children was killed. So they were really concerned about this, and they asked, why are some children doing well in adolescence and some doing poorly? And they invited us, we've done a whole lot of work in the interim, but 10 years later to follow up this original cohort in the Biggers One Kid project. So the Lil One project was about the children and the Biggers One Kid is about the adolescents. We really wanted to get their voices about what their needs were in this community, and this is a picture of the team that's been doing that work. So some preliminary findings, these data are currently being analysed, but many of these children reported complex early life trauma. And in screening, many of them screened positive for anxiety and depression and had ideas of suicide and had post-traumatic stress disorder. And despite the fact that the community had the data and the health department was aware of this data, very few of these children had been able to access NDIS support. Partly because there was no one to help them apply for these forms, which are cumbersome. And then even if you do get support, what do you do in these remote communities if there's no transport and there's no services available? 19% of these girls and boys had had a child by the age of 17 to 19. 83% of them, and this refers to a comment someone made this morning, said no one has ever made me feel important. But despite all of this, when we looked at their hopefulness, they were very hopeful. They were for a future. They were very resilient. They had strong aspirations. And the things that really keep them happy and healthy are family and friends, fishing and hunting, traditional activities, music and culture, art, peer relationships, when they sleep well, and being involved in sport and cultural activities. And so during the project, we developed a social and emotional wellbeing program where we did exactly the sorts of things that we've heard about this morning, taking them on country trips, fishing and hunting, pamper days for the girls, art and music workshops, and community healing camps. We provided some baby brain training so they could understand child development and positive parenting workshops. And we provided training for senior local Aboriginal people in the gatekeeper suicide response. But a lot of what was provided by the team, and the team was some non-Aboriginal researchers and clinicians, as well as 2 key youth workers, a male and female Aboriginal person. And a lot of the work that they did, which alleviated a lot of these symptoms of stress, were practical supports. So believe it or not, in Australia, many children are not registered at birth. They have no birth certificate. If you don't have a birth certificate, you can't get a driver's licence, a Medicare card, etc. So they did a lot of work in helping them prepare for education, enrol in education, get support from Centrelink, get a driver's licence, get a birth certificate, get a bank card, take them out on on-country activities, etc. So I really think in these communities a lot of the stress can be alleviated by just this practical assistance, by mentoring, and by being able to establish relationships with someone who's trusting and knows the community. So in the long term, we do need a culturally appropriate youth social and emotional wellbeing or mental health service for the community. And this was requested for 100% of the families and the kids that we interviewed. And I might say 10 years on, we got over 95% of the parents and the children from the original study participating. We were fortunate to get funding even before this study is reported from the Mental Health Commission of Western Australia. Many of them said, and we heard this morning again, there's nothing to do. And yet, with on-country activities, they connect with culture and community. So how do we diagnose fetal alcohol spectrum disorder? We use the Australian Guide to the Diagnosis, which was developed in 2016, and the key factors are prenatal alcohol exposure, establishing severe neurodevelopmental impairment in several domains of function, and looking for these physical features which may or may not be present. But we also feel it's important to exclude other things that could be causing neurodevelopmental problems, such as lead poisoning, iron deficiency, trauma, or genetic disorders. We use a guide to help women point to what they drank and tell us how much they drank. But of course that's not always possible, as children are not always living with their birth parent. But we do use eyewitness accounts as well. And then we have a multidisciplinary team that will assess a whole range of abilities such as IQ, motor skills, language function, academic achievement, memory, etc. And then we look for these physical features, those 3 characteristic ones of the narrow eye openings, the flat, long philtrum, and the upper lip. And we have done some work in this population to look at which is the best lip philtrum guide to use in these Aboriginal kids. But of course, you know, an Aboriginal child one will be very different from another. And so fortunately, the facial features are not crucial to the diagnosis, but can be helpful if they're present because they make you more certain that the neurodevelopmental problems are due to alcohol than to something else. And we also look for these physical features, which again are very varied. Now, in Australia, we're also lucky to have a national surveillance system for paediatric disorders called the Australian Paediatric Surveillance Unit, and we've been using that for some years, where we ask paediatricians every month to report any case that they see newly diagnosed with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. So this is new cases, not prevalent or total cases in the community. And we get reports from paediatricians all over the country, but you can see that there's a bit of a dearth of paediatric services in many of those remote areas in central and northern Australia. And the map on the right shows where government-funded clinics currently exist, so they're few and far between, but should be able to provide leadership and training. So what do we know? Just a snapshot of from this national data now of children under the age of 15. There were 1,174 children, median age of 8 when they present to us, so just at that age in primary school where they're starting to have learning and behavioural problems. Slight over-representation of males and a marked over-representation of Indigenous people at 55%. About 75% of these kids have had contact with child protection, so you will see them if you're a child protection worker. You will see them if you're a school teacher. Only 20% of these children in the national data set are living with a biological parent, and there's an overrepresentation of children in remote and very remote communities. And these kids have all the features that we expect. Confirmed prenatal alcohol exposure, but interestingly, many of them, as you can see at the bottom of that first column, also have exposure to other drugs, particularly cannabis and nicotine, but also some other illicit drugs. They all have severe neurodevelopment, and the things that they really struggle with are attention. So many of them come to us with a diagnosis of ADHD, problems with executive functioning, that is, planning and conducting complex tasks, problems with living skills, social communication, with their schoolwork and with their language. Only 1 in 5 have the 3 of those characteristic facial features, but 1 in 5 of these children in the national data set have microcephaly. That is a head circumference that is smaller than 3 in every 100 children of the same age and sex. So in other words, they've had a brain injury sufficient to really impair the brain of the growth of that brain. And many of them have some minor or major birth defects. About half of them had reported early life trauma. A lot of them had sleep disorders, about a quarter, and yet only 40% of them had been able to obtain NDIS function. No FASD will be pleased to know that 90% of these children had been referred to the National Organisation for FASD, which provides support and information for parents. Now, we're just starting to analyse this data. I won't go into it in detail, but what this shows is children with fetal alcohol syndrome who had either had exposure to alcohol only in the red bars or to alcohol plus cannabis. And you can see that cannabis made adaptive function worse, made affect or mood worse, made motor function worse, and made skills worse, made sleep worse. Interestingly, academic performance was slightly better in children who were exposed to cannabis as well as alcohol. But what this suggests to us, and we're going to be looking at the other drug exposures, is that these drugs have an additive effect. And really the advice should be to all women that they should avoid alcohol and all other drugs during pregnancy. We're also interested in looking at mental health, and I'd be really pleased to talk to you later about the mental health problems in these children, because my perception is that we're really not recognising, we're not screening, diagnosing or managing these in early childhood. And that really is leading to problems in the teenage years and in adulthood. So you can see here, for example, 71% of the kids had ADHD, 26% intellectual disability, 26% of them autism spectrum disorder, and a range of other conditions. And all of these were occurred at a prevalence much higher than in the general population. And some of them occurred higher in boys than girls. For example, girls were more likely to have a specific learning difficulty than boys, but boys were more likely to have disruptive behaviours or aggression. A student of ours has recently looked in detail at the congenital abnormalities that have occurred in these children in the national data. 80% of them had a major or minor congenital anomaly, in addition to having the diagnosis of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And the higher risk levels of prenatal alcohol exposure or the presence of the 3 facial features made it more likely, not surprisingly, that you would have one of these birth defects. And if we look at those birth defects, the majority that we saw were the facial defects, but we were also seeing, as I said, microcephaly in 1 in 5 children, short stature in 1 in 5 children. And the coloured bars are what we saw in the children with FASD, and the grey bars are what we know in the general population. So certainly the facial features microcephaly much more common in children with FASD. Now, FASD has been recognised in juvenile justice settings, and many of you will remember that dreadful program that revealed the treatment of children in the Northern Territory in the Not Detention Centre, and this sparked a royal commission of inquiry into the treatment of children in the Northern Territory. And sadly, that inquiry really hasn't been implemented yet. So we've had inquiries and we've had royal commissions, and no one has acted on those findings. Carol Bauer, and we heard some data from this morning, did the only prevalence study that's been done in an Australian juvenile justice setting, looking at 100 children who were in detention at Banksia Hill. Most of them were male, most of them were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. 89% of them had a severe neurodevelopmental impairment in at least one domain of function. 36% of them, over a third of them, had fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. But what was telling was most had never had any prior assessment, and you cannot believe that these children would not have been struggling at school with or at home with behaviour. None of them had a prior diagnosis of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and there was unrecognised intellectual disability, so an IQ below 70. So FASD has been sadly in our news nationally. We've all heard about the civil unrest in Alice Springs. Some of that has been attributed to FASD, and experts there have said that an earlier diagnosis will help tackle that crime wave. In Western Australia, delays in assessment for FASD, it said, leave vulnerable children missing out on vital help, and we can well believe that. And this has prompted some commentary recently in The Guardian. What is fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and why do so many children end up in Australia's justice system? Now, we've all heard about the problems at Banksia Hill, and hearing the presentation this morning was just so refreshing that there are alternatives that are effective, are evidence-based, are being evaluated, and we've really got to look at these alternatives. The Children's Court President blasted the corrective services after this event in 2023, when a 17-year-old boy with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder started a fire in his cell. But it turned out that he'd been subjected to 23-hour solitary confinement for weeks on end, which the judge said was amounting to extrajudicial and unlawful punishment. So, you know, these children are going into the justice system disadvantaged, and we're actually punishing them further in the justice system, denying them their human rights. In fact, you may have read the Western Australia Premier's response to the riots that occurred at Banksia Hill. He told the media that the riots at the prison were a form of terrorism. This is a child's prison. He also asserted that disabilities, including fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, was being used as an excuse for appalling behaviour. Now, obviously, we want the community to be safe. We don't condone appalling behaviour. We don't condone violent behaviour. But these are the same children that I mentioned previously. Virtually none of them had ever been assessed. We don't know whether this child had a mental age of 5 or of 6. We do not know what their background history was. So I just want to quickly talk about the pathway to both fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and in turn to juvenile justice. We know that there are a whole lot of social, political and commercial determinants of FASD, and I say commercial because we know that the alcohol industry has a responsibility here, which they are not prepared to address. So that we know that a background of trauma, abuse and violence, poverty, racism, decreased access to resources and services, historic trauma, including, for example, the stolen generation, and ready access to alcohol and other drugs leads to disadvantage. We know that there are family and environmental determinants of FASD, and I've mentioned some of them, living in rural and remote settings, historic trauma, lack of healthcare, particularly antenatal care, contraception, for example, lack of educational opportunities, employment, access to alcohol and other drugs, food insecurity. And of course there are genetic and other risk factors, but there's also, which was mentioned earlier this morning, intergenerational aspects. So some of the parents we see of our children in Fitzroy Valley have themselves got fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and can't possibly be expected to deal with children that any of us would find challenging. So then once you've got a child with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, with a brain injury, with early life trauma, with limited access to health, education and safety, as we've heard again this morning, these are children who are predisposed to being impulsive, inattentive, they've got cognitive problems, perhaps even intellectual disability. They have problems with social skills and language. They can't understand court orders. They have problems with their memory. They can't give accurate evidence. They may confabulate or make up facts. They don't learn from their mistakes, and they have difficulty understanding right from wrong. And yet some of these, as young as 10 years, we're jailing in Australia. And they often make the progress then from out-of-home care to the juvenile justice system, often with really petty crime, but they're locked up because there's nowhere else to put them. We've just written a paper for the Judicial Quarterly Report on addressing the challenges of FASD for adolescents in the justice system. One of the things we emphasise is, why are these children behaving as they are? And it's because of the brain injury that they have, and there really needs to be better understanding in the justice system about that. On Tuesday morning, I was in Parliament House, Canberra, with Anne Hollins, who's the Children's Commissioner for the Australian Human Rights Commission. They've just released a report on how Australia needs to transform child justice to improving safety and well-being, and I wish she'd been here today because I think some of the answers have been prevented. But she says in this report, the treatment of children in the criminal justice system is one of the most urgent human rights issues facing Australia today. Lack of access to human rights is both a precursor to contact with the justice system and a consequence of contact with the justice system. And again, when we're trying to help these children, we cannot be doing more harm. And what was interesting was when I read the report last night, I realised that the characteristics of the children that they're seeing in juvenile justice are very similar to the characteristics of the children that I've just mentioned with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander, contact with child protection, themselves often having alcohol and other drug disorders, living in very remote communities, having FASD, low socioeconomic status, having mental health problems, boys a bit more than girls, intellectual disability, and failure to be enrolled in education, and often a parent in prison. So exactly the same sort of risk factors that we see in FASD. Now, our government has made a big commitment to FASD. We've had 2 national inquiries, and we were the first country to have a national strategic action plan, which is being implemented at the moment and being evaluated. So that's a good start. We have funding for the FASD Hub Australia, which is a resource for health professionals, policymakers and researchers, and I'd urge you to have a look at that and give us feedback if there's anything that needs to be improved. We have a fabulous national organisation to provide support, training and education for families and people living with FASD, and do go and visit their stand up the back. And we have a resource, a website for teachers. This one is currently addressed to primary school teachers, but we've just got some more funding to expand that to secondary school teachers, not to make the diagnosis, but to just be alert that this is one of the causes of neurodevelopmental problems in schools. We have a strong preventative program at the moment, a national awareness campaign, Every Moment Matters, resources developed by NACCHO, and a guideline that says quite clearly that if you're planning a pregnancy or pregnant, you should not drink. And after many years, we have warning labels now on all alcohol products. So FASD is complex, it's increasingly recognised, it's got severe service implications and costs. We need a systematic approach to recognising it and that requires increased capacity in health, education and justice professionals. We know that early diagnosis promotes better outcomes. We need support for children with FASD who end up in the justice system. And we need to address the social, economic and commercial determinants of both FASD and entry into the justice system. And I haven't mentioned this, but we do need to reform, obviously, our justice system. We need to look at alternative pathways, and we need to increase the age of incarceration, which is currently 10, and the international recommendation is 14 at a minimum. And prevention is the key. Thank you.